what's up everybody? Dan Pickett, co-founder here at Launch Academy, here to bring you another episode of the HTML show. So glad to have you with us. In the previous 2 episodes or so, we've been really taking a deep dive on what it is to work on the web and what the process and protocols that are involved in the process of publishing to the web and also accessing web pages through that HTTP protocol. And we've done a wonderful job here. Our development environment is really starting to shape up where we're practicing like professionals. We're using a real editor and editing and hard coding HTML, CSS, and today we'll even do a brief foray into a little bit of JavaScript. And now we're at a place where we have to get started from a professional setting. So we've got the editor, we've got the local hosting through the MAMP tool, which we introduced to you in the previous episode. Today, I want to focus on using a professional template and working with a professional template. Imagine if there was just this wonderful starting point by which you could start every web page project that you begin and have all of the best sort of thoughts and established patterns of thought leaders in the front-end engineering space and kind of have it all reflected in one template and one starting point. Well, you don't have to imagine that because the wonderful folks at the HTML5 Boilerplate has gone ahead and done that for us. And today I want to walk you through this boilerplate, through this template, and really talk about the importance of these conventions and why this template is designed and established the way it is. And there's perspective and convention around how the whole file system is organized, but it also sets some precedents for us around how we should organize our HTML, our CSS, and our JavaScript. And I want to walk through all of that with you today so that moving forward you have a professional place, a really good starting point for you to continue to push forward in your front-end engineering work and all of the awesome projects that you're going to release out onto the web. So in order to do that, let's go ahead and download the HTML5 boilerplate together. And what I've done is I've already unzipped it and I've actually added it to our working project here. And you'll notice that there's a whole lot of files that is in this HTML5 boilerplate. And what I want to do is I want to actually focus first on the HTML document itself before we dive into all of the different files that are in here and what they all mean. So let's go ahead and pull up the index.html here on our local web page. And one thing that we might want to do as well is actually point MAMP to our local file system that we're working with here. And I'm going to go ahead and do that by changing my document root in the web server tool here. And I'm going to go to episode 11. I've got a little sort of organized file system here. And so my servers are going to start now pointing at the downloaded HTML5 boilerplate that I've set up. MAMP's going to open up. And I'm going to open up another MAMP sort of page here. And hello world, this is the HTML5 boilerplate. So we've got a local version of our HTML5 template working here. And we've got it open in the browser thanks to MAMP. And also in our editor, thanks to Adam. And notice that the HTML5 template right now doesn't look like very much. It's not really doing all that much for us in the browser. And that's the whole intent. It's intended to give you a starting point for which to create all of your web projects moving forward. So let's dive into the markup in the file system so that you get a better understanding of what's happening here. So notice that in my MAMP sort of configuration here, I don't have a specific file like we have in the past with hello.html, right? And that's because we use a special file name for our index or our main page called index.html. In MAMP, Apache, and Nginx, all of sort of modern web servers look for the presence of this file so that it's a reasonable default if I just go to the default page of a given host. So notice here I didn't have to specify index.html or anything like that, and that's based on the convention that is established and sort of well known within the web development community, that index.html is going to render when I just access the slash path. So we get that nice default, already getting benefit from the HTML5 boilerplate. So let's go ahead and dive into the specifics of all the work that's being done here for us. And this HTML document has a lot of material that we may not yet be familiar with. So I want to walk through each line by line, and kind of show you why the HTML5 boilerplate is set up the way that it is. So first we have our doc type. And if you're not familiar with the doc type, go back to the very first few episodes of our time together. Basically, this is informing the browser what type of markup we're dealing with so that it knows how to render it. And then we see our opening HTML tag, and always good to specify a lang here. And it's going to prompt us for that as part of the boilerplate. And then this Node.js class is important because we're going to use this in the context of Modernizer and a few other tools. But basically, this is going to default when we render the page. And then we're going to actually have client-side code, JavaScript code running that's actually going to take that class away from the HTML element. So something interesting and new that we'll see as part of this whole boilerplate kind of program. And here we're seeing setting the default character set. We talked a little bit about character encoding, but basically at the time of this recording, UTF-8 provides us with a wide array of characters, international characters, even emojis that we can use as part of our HTML document. So setting the intended set of characters that we can use, or the universe of characters that we can use, basically again informs the browser about how it's going to render the page. And this is all located in the head element of our HTML document. This next item is a hint for the Internet Explorer web browser. So when we're setting the compatibility of the user agent, we're basically telling Internet Explorer what rendering engine to use. So as early as I believe IE7 or IE8, Internet Explorer actually ships with different versions of the rendering engines. And you can actually change the rendering engine that you're using in the context of the Internet Explorer browser that you're using. And what we want to do is we want to inform Internet Explorer to always use the latest rendering engine, because otherwise there may be dated or bad rendering practices that we may have seen in IE7 or IE8 or IE9, right? So using this user agent compatibility is basically telling Internet Explorer to use the latest rendering engine, so we run into the least amount of bugs that way. The title tag we know all about. That's going to inform the browser and also give some hints towards search engines around what this web page and document is going to be about. We talked about the meta description showing underneath the search engine result link and kind of giving the end user that searches a description of the content and what they're going to see when they click on that link. Then we've got this new thing called the viewport. And the viewport is really intended for mobile devices. So if you've ever pulled up a web page on a mobile device, you may notice that it's at a different zooming level than what you may see when you pull it up on a desktop. And this viewport setting is basically saying that we want to specify the available viewport to the full resolution of the device's width. Whether it's a tablet, whether it's a mobile device like an iPhone or an Android, a Samsung Galaxy if you will, or if it's your desktop, you're on an HDMI display or on a 1024 by 768 display, whatever your resolution is, this viewport tag is basically saying we want our entire web page to scale the entire width of the device, and we want that scale to be at 1. So we can sort of mess with this initial scale to kind of set a default zoom rate. But 9 times out of 10, your viewport setting is going to mimic exactly what the HTML5 boilerplate has provided for you. And then next we have the icon that's going to show up if I save the web page on an iOS device, whether it's an iPhone or an iPad. Having this point to an icon is basically going to say if I bookmark this page or if I add it to my home screen on my iOS device, this icon is going to be what's used so that it shows up on the welcome screen in such a way. So the Apple Touch icon is going to be used for iOS devices as sort of the image that represents the web page itself. And the default that HTML5 boilerplate provides is just a little star. So if you had this open on mobile Safari and you said save to my home screen, this is the icon that you would see on the home screen on the mobile device. So already getting some utility for handling for our mobile and tablet devices thanks to HTML5 boilerplate. Next, we point to a few CSS documents, and we're going to dive into those CSS documents. As you remember or may recall from some previous lessons, we talked about how it's important to separate concerns and how it's important to have our CSS documents sort of dedicated in a special place so that we know where to reference them. So notice here we're using relative paths to point to the normalize.css document and the main.css document. And this gives us the ability to basically add additional styling to our HTML5 document. And we'll dive into the specifics of each of these documents in just a bit. But for now, let's continue working down the HTML5 document itself and talking about all the important and good stuff that the HTML5 boilerplate supplies for us. Lastly, in the head tag, what we see is a reference to a modernizer library. So I mentioned that up here we've got some JavaScript manipulated code here that is going to be eliminated when we render the page. One thing that we haven't talked about in the context of our browser is that every browser actually ships with a programming language interpreter. And in most cases, that language is going to be JavaScript. And we write JavaScript as a way to do additional programming on what we call the client side so that users can have a more interactive, fun, and interesting experience while browsing our web page. And for the first time, we see the use of some JavaScript in our HTML document. And this library in particular, called the Modernizer library, is providing us with a mechanism to essentially handle HTML5 elements with browsers that are older than HTML5. So if I'm on IE7, for example, there are certain parts of the HTML5 standard that the IE7 browser was not yet made aware of. So Modernizer acts as a sort of bridge that would allow an IE7 user to still have a decent user experience, even though we're coding the entire HTML web page in HTML5, a version of HTML that the browser at the time did not know anything about. So we use Modernizer to basically support backwards compatible web browsers, mainly IE7 and IE8, because they're so predominantly used in corporate environments and things like that. They can tend to be very slow to upgrade versions of major web browsers. So you want to make sure that you have this Modernizer library incorporated into all of your projects moving forward so that you can provide the best experience for some of those laggards, those folks that are holding on to older versions of major web browsers. So this Modernizer library is going to run every time we load the page and basically check to see if we're using an older version of, say, Internet Explorer or even Firefox or something like that. And on the client side, it's going to do its magic to basically translate all of our HTML version 5 material into earlier versions like HTML4 or even HTML3, right? So Modernizer just gives us the ability to support and be backwards compatible for older web browsers. So really nice that they include that as part of the overall template. The next thing that I wanted to cover is inside the body tag. And I'm going to blow this up because it might be a little dark to see on the screen. But essentially what we see here for the first time is what's known as a conditional comment. And this conditional comment is basically a way for us using HTML to orient or offer specific markup for specific browsers. And we use a little bit of language here to logically handle for different browser versions. And what this conditional comment is saying is that if we're less than IE version 8, we're going to prompt the user to upgrade their browser. So while Modernizer can do some wonderful things with both IE7 and IE8, IE7 is just a really old browser and it's not up to date with some of the most recent standards and developments that have been happening in the World Wide Web for the last 5 to 7 years. So we want to make sure that if a user pulls up our web page using IE7 or even worse, IE6, which is notoriously known in the web development community as a really sort of bad player as it pertains to adhering to standards and everything that the W3C is putting out. So we want to make sure that we present the user with an experience that basically says, hey, you're not going to get an ideal sort of browsing experience here if you're using Internet Explorer 7 or Internet Explorer 6. So go ahead and upgrade your browser. So essentially everything inside these conditional comments will render if I'm using IE7 or IE7 or IE6. So this if statement basically translates to if the end user is using anything before Internet Explorer 8, show this error message or this kind of prompt to download a more current browser. The other important thing to note about this language is that it has to be the Internet Explorer browser for this error message to render. Otherwise, it'll just be ignored completely. So this is basically saying if I'm using Internet Explorer, and it's any version that is less than version 8, I want you to show everything that's inside the conditional comment. So from lines 18 to lines 20, this is known as a conditional comment in the web development community. And we often use these to highlight old versions of Internet Explorer and kind of allow users to see some conditional content if they're using older versions of today's modern web browsers. Cool. All right, so then we get some more familiar markup, things that we're kind of used to seeing at this point. So we get a comment and then we get a paragraph tag. But at the end of the page, we see some more JavaScript, which is pretty interesting. For the first time, we're seeing the availability of additional client-side code that we would want to run when our browser actually hits the web page and downloads the web page. So all this script is basically going to be downloaded and run through the interpreter that comes with every modern browser, and it's going to run and enhance the experience that we can deliver to our end user. And we're not going to talk too much about JavaScript throughout the duration of the course, but just know that essentially there's a programming language that you can run on or within your browser. We call that client-side scripting. And it basically allows us to customize, hone, and improve the experience for the end user using code. We're going to focus primarily on HTML and CSS, but important to know that there's code that can be run in the context of our web page in our web browser. And then lastly, we get some boilerplate as it pertains to JavaScript that allows us to use Google Analytics. So one thing that's really cool that we like to use in general is a way to keep track of what users are doing on our web page when they arrive. And we love to kind of look at that in an aggregate and gain perspective on what we can improve or make better about our web pages. So most modern web pages will have what we call this Google Analytics snippet. And basically this sends information to the Google Analytics service so that we can later go and look at everything that's happening for end users through their tool. And that's given to us for free. And in return, Google gets our advertising dollars, and also we build better web experiences for the web, which Google is thankfully all about. And in a later episode, I'll actually show you how to set up Google Analytics so that you can do this. But that's going to be further on in past responsive design and some of the other things that we want to accomplish together. So let's go back up the web page and take a look at some of this CSS that is included as part of the overall boilerplate here. So first, I want to take a look at this normalize.css document. And normalize.css is going to do what is very important for us as front-end engineers. So remember I shared in Google Chrome how the HTML browser, whether it's Chrome, Safari, Internet Explorer, Opera, whatever it might be, there's what's known as this user agent style sheet. And a user agent style sheet is a fancy way of saying that the browser has some opinions on how they should aesthetically treat a paragraph tag or an H1 tag or whatever it might be. And what's interesting is not all the browsers agree on what that default aesthetic should be. So what we need is sort of a reset button that brings all of those opinions together so that we can reliably build our web pages so that they look the same across all of the modern and popular web browsers. So to do that, we use a tool that's really wonderful called normalize.css. And this normalize.css essentially does exactly that. It hits the reset button on all the user agent style sheets so we have one clear and a central starting point so that our page will look by default the same across all of our web pages, all of our web browsers. So as we work through and get more sophisticated with our front-end engineering, we're going to need this reset button so that we can have sort of a reliable baseline so that our web page starts at a place where it looks the same in Safari, Opera, Internet Explorer, and all the other modern web browsers. So we're thankful to have Normalize CSS also freely available in open source for us to use and manipulate. But for our purposes, this normalize.css document is not going to change. We've downloaded it, we've made use of it, and it basically has a set of rules that are going to unify the browsing experience across all of those major web browsers. So there are all these kind of cool rules that they've established that basically fix some of the user agent specifics that are present in some of the modern web browsers that are available out there. So the normalize.css supplies us with this really nice reset button so that our browsing experience is the same across all modern web browsers. So we want to be using normalize.css moving forward in the context of all of our web-based projects. Notice as well we've got this main.css document, and HTML5 boilerplate actually does a wonderful job of commenting about some of these opinionated defaults, some of these things that they're deciding to do to basically provide you with a really solid foundation and starting place for all of your web projects. And you can decide to eliminate or maintain all of these, but they're all really well commented and documented. We won't get into the specifics of all of them, but suffice to say, they kind of add additional opinions to the normalize.css so that we don't run into common front-end engineering problems and CSS positioning problems and just some ugly things that occur by default in the front-end engineering world. So you get some wonderful, reasonable defaults through main.css and normalize.css. Awesome. All right, so we've talked about some of the boilerplate CSS. Let's talk about some of the boilerplate JavaScript. So we talked about Modernizer as part of the overall ecosystem here. And notice how this is linked. Notice that it's using a vendor folder for Modernizer. So like normalize.css, Modernizer is a tool, a script that we've downloaded from the web, and we really don't want to change it. It's kind of there and available for us to make use of, and it serves its purpose. So for that reason, the HTML5 boilerplate team has decided to put it in a folder called vendor. And this is a convention that we see very often in the engineering world. And it's basically just a way for us to separate code that we've downloaded and incorporated into our page versus code that we've written and authored by ourselves or independently of open source software. So you'll notice when you download HTML5 Boilerplate that the jQuery library and the Modernizer library are going to be placed in this vendor directory. So as I mentioned, Modernizer is just a way to prevent backwards compatibility issues and basically allow HTML5 to render in really old versions of things like Internet Explorer and Mozilla Firefox. So Modernizer gives us what we in the front-end engineering world call a shim to basically allow us to use modern standards and modern technologies, but still be able to support older browsers and older versions of browsers. So Modernizer is a tool that does exactly that. And if you want to read more about Modernizer, you can go to modernizer.com, and it doesn't have an E in it, so it's MODERNIZR, and it's basically going to walk you through all the things that it does to basically make HTML5 available to older web browsers. So check that out, learn more about Modernizer, but in general, it's just a wonderful tool to have, and it's got wonderful documentation and explains everything that it does from an opinionated standpoint to basically allow the use of HTML5 in older versions of browsers. Awesome. Okay, so let's scroll further down and take a look at the incorporation of jQuery. So on lines 25 and 26, we see the mention of jQuery a couple times. The first line here is actually trying to go out to the web using a fully qualified path, including the SSL protocol that we talked about in how the web works. And basically it's going to go and try to download the latest version of jQuery at the time of this recording and incorporate it into the web page. And jQuery is a very popular library that makes it super easy to manipulate and work with content on our HTML5 web page. We're not going to cover jQuery itself as part of this course, but jQuery basically gives us a library or a framework on top of JavaScript to talk to and manipulate our web pages. And it's very, very popular. It's very, very predominant in the field. So thankfully, HTML5 Boilerplate makes it available to us by default and by convention. Now, what you're seeing here on lines 25 and lines 26 is what's known as a fallback behavior. Remember in a previous episode how I talked about, well, if code.jquery.com goes down, well, then we don't get this library, and now our page is probably going to malfunction. Well, what the code on line 26 says is, if you can't load it off the web, then load it locally using this relative path. And so this is known as a fallback behavior, and it provides redundancy to the network reliance on line 25. So line 25 tries to load jQuery off the web. Line 26 says, okay, well, if you weren't able to load it off the web, go ahead and load it using a relative path. And then we get some additional JavaScript files that gives us some great sort of defaults and default behavior, as well as a place to put our custom JavaScript when we're ready to write it and do that in this main.js file. All right, so we covered really all the contents of the HTML page and all the files that it references. But what about some of these other files in the tree? Well, first I want to talk about the icons themselves. So we see here that we have an Apple Touch icon, and I pulled that up, and this is sort of the HTML5 boilerplate logo that we see here, and it basically is just a placeholder for us to replace. And usually a graphic designer will supply us with a picture of our logo, or maybe something that represents the web page that we're writing. But essentially, it's a graphical representation of what the web page is, so that when we pull it up on our iOS devices, this is the image that renders. We also have a favicon.ico, and I'm going to open that up and show you what that looks like. And notice this in comparison to the Apple Touch icon. We say that the Fave icon actually has a smaller resolution or a smaller width and height because it's a smaller image. It's got different dimensions than the Apple Touch icon. And we see this pretty predominantly throughout the web, where we sort of have an established convention on the width and height of some of these special images that belong in our HTML web pages. So our Apple Touch icon is going to be bigger and more detailed than our Fave icon, which is a smaller image. And notice here, MAMP is actually taking over our Fave icon. Let me see if I can get it to override this. So right now MAMP is overriding the Fave icon, but notice the icons that show up in our Chrome tabs. And these are the faveicon.ico files. So the user agent, usually Safari, Chrome, and a lot of the modern web browsers will try to fetch a faveicon.ico file as part of the default sort of behavior so that it can render it as an icon next to the title of our HTML5 document. So the faveicon.ico file is just going to be located in the root, and it's going to basically be a very simple graphical representation of the web page, much like the Apple Touch icon. So we use the Apple Touch icon to handle for iOS and some of the mobile devices that iOS supports, iPhones, iPads. And then faveicon.ico is basically the image that shows up to the left of the title tag in most modern web browsers tabs. So we see here the variety of fave icons that are downloaded when we access specific web pages. Awesome. All right. I want to talk about a few special files as well that are inside this project root. And by project root, I mean the directory by which all of our files are located. And notice here that we've got a few special files that begin with dots. And we call these dot files because they tend to be very developer focused. So we put a dot in front of them to essentially hide them from your average Joe user. And thankfully now you're a professional web developer, you're writing professional web pages. It's time to learn about what these dot files are and how they can help us as professional developers. So the .editor config file is basically a file that comes default with the HTML5 boilerplate that sets some standards around how an editor should treat this project directory. So we talked about in the very beginnings of the course how there are all kinds of different editors out there. There's Atom, there's Sublime Text, there's Visual Studio, there's Vim and Emacs. There are all these editors out there, and I recommend as you get more experience as a developer that you check them out. But this .editor config file is basically the normalized.css of editors, right? We want to have a common baseline by which the editor will treat this directory, whether it's Vim, Emacs, or Atom. We want it to treat it the same way. We want it to use an UTF-8 char set. We want to set the indent size, and we want to set the indent style. These are really important conventions to establish when you're working with a development team. You want to make sure that you're all on the same page. And that means even if you're using different editors, for example, Spencer might use Sublime Text, I might use Atom, we still want the same rules in place. So this .editor config file is an attempt to do exactly that for us. It's an attempt to normalize all of the editor configurations so that we're using the same conventions in the same white space conventions so that we're all kind of working on the same page. So that's the .editor config file. Secondly, there's this .gitignore file. So we talked a bit about GitHub, and GitHub being sort of the centralized place for all open source software, and it's kind of just the universe kind of resides here of open source software. In fact, HTML5, Boilerplate, Normalized.css, and jQuery, as well as Modernizer, are all hosted and available to us because of GitHub. So GitHub basically leverages a source code management tool called Git. And we won't cover Git as part of this course, But Git basically allows us to keep track of how our code changes over time. And what we need often is a way to ignore files that are not to be tracked by the Git version control system. So this .gitignore file is basically where we'll add those exceptions of files that we don't want added to version control. And then lastly, we have the htxs file. And this htxs file is used by Apache in Nginx to basically set authorization privileges and authorization ideas in the context of our server. And for our purposes, we won't really be using this htxs file, but just know that it's available to us, and it's something that Apache and Nginx will look at to basically ensure that files are secure and readable when we want them to be. Just gonna grab some water here. All right. So .files give us a mechanism by which to basically provide developer-friendly files. And we use this dot to essentially hide them from your average Joe daily user that may not have the development context or mindset. So we use .files as a way to kind of hone and customize our development and server environments. Cool, all right, so we talked about .files. Let's talk about some of the other boilerplate files that are included as part of the HTML5 boilerplate. First, I want to talk about robots.txt. So robots.txt is essentially a file that every modern search engine will look towards to basically tell that search engine what things it should crawl and what things it should not crawl. So for example, if we didn't want our search engine to crawl an administrative backend of our website, we would set disallow to admin star, just like that, or like this. And essentially what we're doing here is we're essentially saying we don't want the Google web crawler, when it goes out and tries to consume information about our web page, we wouldn't want it to access the admin path because that's secret. We don't really want to expose that to a search engine user, so we're going to disallow that. So robots.txt sort of has its own language, which you can learn more about at robotstext.org, to basically instruct popular search engines like Chrome and like Yahoo to basically say, browse over here, but don't browse here. And that file is very important in the context of search engine optimization. Secondly, we have this humans.txt file. And this is kind of a cool thing that we've done as part of just the web development community to kind of give credit to the folks that have produced the web page that you're seeing. So if I'm a developer and I'm interested in learning more about the engineering team over at Google, I could go to the humans.txt at google.com and read more about them. And often you'll see the team highlighted first, anyone that they need to give thanks to, and oftentimes too they may highlight some of the technologies and open source projects that they've used as part of the library. So HTML5 boilerplate kind of gives us a nice template for what that looks like. All right, so let's talk about two sort of odd birds that you really won't need to concern yourself with all that much. One is the crossdomain.xml file. And the crossdomain.xml file basically allows us to do some request and response from foreign web pages. So the foreign web pages here basically are denied access from issuing sort of cross-domain requests. And you can learn more about this crossdomain.xml file in the documentation of the HTML5 boilerplate. But essentially what it does is allows for cross-domain requests and responses to be issued. There are some security features that come as part of our web browsers that essentially allow us to issue requests from one host to another host. And Chrome and Safari and a few other browsers try to be very restrictive about how developers can do that from a security standpoint. So what we need to do is we need to set a cross-domain policy if we're going to allow that kind of behavior. And 9 times out of 10, especially in the very early days for you as a web developer, you can just leave this document the way it is and the way it sits, and you can tweak it later when you need to authorize those types of things. And then last but not least is the browser config.xml file. And this is a tool really for Internet Explorer 11 that's going to point different resolutions of logos to a specific file in your project directory. And so like we have the Apple Touch icon that essentially supports iOS devices and provides a nice resolution image for iOS devices, we have this tile and tilewide.png files that are basically going to render tiles in the i11 browser in a nice format and a nice manner. So we use this browser config.xml file to point to those tile images. And again, this is just going to supply the default HTML5 boilerplate sort of image here. And what we want to do is when we start a new project, we want to replace that favicon.ico, the Apple Touch icon, and these tile.png files to represent the brand and the image that we want to convey to our end users. So thankfully this is all here for us to kind of overwrite and use, but really I just want to stress the importance of establishing good conventions and having a nice organized file system structure and adhering to that structure from project to project. It's going to make it easier for you to manage all these different projects and to know where everything lives in the context of your modern web project. So what I'd love for you to do is take your HTML that you've been producing in previous episodes and incorporate it into this HTML5 boilerplate. So take the body of your HTML document as well as all the CSS that you've written and incorporate it into a boilerplate based directory structure so that it's taking advantage of the wonderful things like normalize.css as well as the modernizer library. Go ahead and do that, and I'm looking forward to seeing you in the chat. Be sure to show your work, show me how it's going, show me screenshots. I love seeing all of that work, and I think it's wonderful to see the progress that your peers are making as well. So I hope to see you on Thursday. We're going to be talking about positioning, floats, clears, all that fun stuff. We'll also be talking about absolute and relative positioning. So I hope you'll join us on Thursday. And hey, if you're enjoying the program so far, I hope that you'll check launchacademy.com out and actually give a look at our online and on-campus programs. We have a lot to offer in terms of training and preparing you for a career in web development. So if you're really digging this front-end engineering and all this front-end work that you're doing, I wonder what it would be like for you to take a look at some of the back-end technology as well as just the more full-stack web development stuff that we teach at Launch Academy. So if you're even the slightest bit interested in a career in web development, go to launchacademy.com, read about some of our academic programs, read about some of the things that will enable you to do once you graduate from our program. Change your life, become a developer. Life's too short to not love what you do. So I hope you'll check us out. Check out the proven results that we've offered for our students, and we've really done a wonderful job of changing lives, and I want to help change your life. I want to help you love what you do. So give us a look. If you have any questions about any of the programs, hit me up on Slack or email me directly. I'm at dan@launchacademy.com. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.